High blood pressure is still one of the most common and most dangerous health problems in the United States. Nearly half of American adults have it, and it remains a major risk factor for heart disease and stroke. That is exactly why so many people feel alarmed when their numbers stay high, or when they need more than one strategy to keep them under control. Most people are told to think about blood pressure in one simple way: too much salt, too much pressure, too much strain on the system. And yes, sodium matters. It absolutely does. But if that is the only lens you use, you may miss the bigger picture entirely. Because for many adults, especially in midlife and beyond, high blood pressure is not just about what is on the plate. It is also about what is happening in the blood vessels, in the kidneys, in metabolic health, and in the daily habits that quietly shape cardiovascular risk over time. NHLBI notes that high blood pressure is influenced by multiple factors, including high salt and low potassium diets, physical inactivity, poor sleep, stress, alcohol, and other health conditions. Stay with me, because one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming blood pressure is only a salt problem, when in reality, it is often a whole body pattern. That is why two people can seem to be doing the same obvious thing and get completely different results. One person cuts back on salty processed foods and sees their numbers improve. Another does that too, but their readings barely budge. That does not always mean they are doing something wrong. It may mean other drivers are still in play. Things like excess weight, poor sleep, low physical activity, chronic stress, insulin resistance, or blood vessels that are becoming less flexible over time. In other words, the pressure is not only about what is flowing through the system, it is also about the condition of the system itself. Think of it this way. If you only focus on the fluid inside the pipes, but ignore whether the pipes are becoming stiff, irritated, or harder to relax, you are not seeing the full picture. And that matters because blood pressure is not just a number on a home monitor. It is a warning sign tied to long-term risk for heart disease, stroke, and other serious complications. That is why people get so frustrated when they do one healthy thing and still do not feel fully in control. The truth is, blood pressure usually responds best when you stop chasing one trigger and start seeing the larger pattern. Now, this does not mean sodium suddenly stops mattering. It still matters a great deal. Cutting back on excess sodium is one of the most established ways to help lower blood pressure, especially when it is combined with a dietary pattern like DASH and more potassium-rich foods such as fruits, vegetables, beans, and other minimally processed foods. Current public health guidance continues to emphasize lowering sodium, improving diet quality, and building a more heart-supportive eating pattern. But here is the shift that changes everything. Once you realize blood pressure is not just a salt story, the next question becomes much more important. What is actually happening at the blood vessel wall? Why do some vessels stay more relaxed and resilient while others become less responsive over time? And why can that make blood pressure harder to manage even when someone thinks they are already doing the basics? That is where the conversation gets much more interesting and much more useful. So what is actually happening at the vessel wall, and why can that matter so much for blood pressure? Inside every artery is a paper-thin lining called the endothelium. It may sound minor, but it is one of the most important control surfaces in the cardiovascular system. This lining helps regulate how well blood vessels relax, how smoothly blood moves, how the vessel responds to stress, and how inflammation is handled over time. When the endothelium is functioning well, arteries are better able to stay calm, responsive, and flexible. When it begins to function poorly, the vessels often become less able to relax the way they should. Endothelial dysfunction is closely linked with hypertension and with broader cardiovascular risk, and that leads to a bigger shift in how we think about high blood pressure. For many people, blood pressure is treated like a force problem only, but over time, it can also become a vessel quality problem. Healthy arteries are not rigid pipes. They are meant to expand slightly with each heartbeat and then recoil. That elastic response helps absorb part of the pressure created when the heart pumps blood forward. In a healthier system, the arteries act a bit like shock absorbers. In a stiffer system, they lose some of that buffering ability, so more pressure is pushed forward with each beat. That is one reason systolic pressure often rises as arterial stiffness increases, especially with aging and long-term vascular stress. Arterial stiffness is strongly associated with hypertension, cardiovascular events, and mortality. A simple way to picture it is this: a healthy artery behaves more like a flexible shock absorber, while a stiff artery behaves more like a rigid tube that sends pressure forward instead of softening it. Blood is still moving through both, but the system is not handling pressure the same way, and that difference matters. Because once arteries become less flexible, blood pressure is no longer just about what is in the bloodstream. It is also about how the vessel wall is responding to years of wear, stress, inflammation, metabolic strain, and elevated pressure itself. Similar blood pressure readings do not always mean identical vascular health underneath. This is also why experts pay attention to arterial stiffness as more than a side note. One of the best non-invasive ways to assess large artery stiffness is carotid femoral pulse wave velocity, often considered the gold standard measure in research and specialist settings. It is not a routine test in every clinic, but the concept behind it is important. The faster the pressure wave travels, the stiffer the artery tends to be. In other words, the vessel wall itself tells an important part of the story. Now, this does not mean blood pressure medication is pointless. That would be the wrong takeaway. Medication can lower blood pressure and reduce the risk of major complications, including heart attack and stroke. But medication is usually only one part of the long-term picture. Diet quality, sodium intake, potassium-rich foods, physical activity, sleep, body weight, metabolic health, and medical care often work best together. So if someone only looks at the number on the monitor but never thinks about what is happening to the vessel wall, they may be missing the deeper pattern that helps explain why blood pressure becomes harder to manage over time. And that brings us to the next key piece, because one of the most important signals that helps blood vessels relax can begin to weaken long before many people realize it. Now let's move into one of the most overlooked parts of the blood pressure story: the signals that tell your blood vessels when to relax. One of the most important of those signals is nitric oxide. You do not need the biochemistry to understand the big picture. Nitric oxide helps blood vessels open more normally and respond more smoothly to the pressure of blood moving through them. When that signaling is working well, circulation tends to be more efficient and the vessel wall is better able to adapt. But when that signal weakens, blood vessels may become less responsive over time. And that matters more than many people realize, because this kind of change can develop quietly, long before someone thinks of it as a blood pressure issue. Nitric oxide remains a central part of endothelial function and vascular tone regulation. This is also where a lot of people miss the real opportunity. They think exercise is only about burning calories or losing weight. But movement affects far more than body size. It influences vascular function, metabolic health, insulin sensitivity, and the daily stress load placed on the cardiovascular system. In other words, regular movement helps shape the environment your blood vessels are living in day after day. That is one reason physical activity remains one of the most evidence-based tools for supporting healthier blood pressure. NHL, BI, and CDC both continue to emphasize regular physical activity as a core part of blood pressure management and cardiovascular health. For most adults, the smartest place to start is not complicated. It is consistency. Walk more, sit less. Build a pattern your body can actually keep. Brisk walking, cycling, swimming, and other aerobic exercise all help. Strength training matters too, not just for muscle, but because better muscle health can support insulin sensitivity and broader cardiometabolic function. Current public health guidance recommends at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity each week, along with muscle strengthening activity on 2 or more days per week. And for someone who feels overwhelmed, even a daily walking habit can be a strong beginning. There is also one lesser known option that deserves attention: isometric exercise. This includes sustained muscle contractions such as hand grip holds or wall squats. It is not usually the first thing people think about, but recent pooled research has shown that isometric exercise can have meaningful effects on resting blood pressure. That does not mean it replaces aerobic activity, strength training, or medical care. It means it may be a useful add on for some people who want another structured, time efficient tool. So before you assume your blood pressure story is only about food, or only about salt, or only about medication, ask yourself something more revealing. How much is your body actually moving each week? Because one of the most powerful ways to support healthier vessel function is often not hidden at all. It is repeated movement over and over until the body starts responding differently. And that is exactly why this matters so much. If you're getting real value from this, subscribe now, because small daily habits can change far more than most people realize. Now we come to one of the most important reasons blood pressure can stay stubbornly high, even when people think they are trying to eat better: insulin resistance. Most people hear that phrase and think only about blood sugar or diabetes. But insulin resistance can affect much more than that. It is closely tied to excess body fat, especially around the abdomen, higher inflammation, poorer metabolic health, and greater strain on the cardiovascular system. For many adults in the United States, this becomes one of the hidden patterns sitting underneath high blood pressure for years before it is fully recognized. That is one reason blood pressure is often harder to control in people who are overweight, less active, sleeping poorly, or already drifting toward prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. Part of the reason this matters is that the body does not regulate blood pressure in isolation. The kidneys, hormones, blood vessels, and metabolic system are constantly influencing one another. When metabolic health starts to worsen, the body may become less efficient at handling sodium balance, vascular tone, and overall cardiovascular stress. That does not mean insulin resistance is the only cause of high blood pressure. It is not. But for many people, it is one of the missing pieces that helps explain why the numbers do not improve as much as expected from one small dietary change alone. This is why two people can both say, "I already cut back on salt," and still have very different outcomes. If one person is also carrying significant visceral fat, sleeping 5 hours a night, eating a highly processed diet, and barely moving during the week, their blood pressure story may be much more about the total metabolic load than about sodium alone. That is the bigger picture many people miss. So, what deserves the biggest focus here? First, food quality matters more than most people think. Diets built around minimally processed foods tend to support blood pressure and metabolic health far better than diets centered on ultra-processed snacks, sugary drinks, refined carbohydrates, and constant grazing. That does not mean perfection. It means shifting the pattern. More vegetables, beans, fruit, high fiber foods, lean proteins, and meals that are built to satisfy rather than spike and crash. DASH-style eating remains one of the best supported approaches for blood pressure control. Second, body weight and movement matter because they directly affect insulin sensitivity over time. Even moderate improvements in weight, exercise habits, and sleep can support healthier blood pressure. And third, meal timing may help some people, but it is not the whole answer. Time-restricted eating can be useful in certain cases, especially when it helps reduce overeating and improve overall structure. But it is not a universal solution, and it should never distract from the bigger foundations: diet quality, movement, sleep, and long-term consistency. So if blood pressure is more than salt and more than one pill, what deserves the biggest focus first? The answer is simpler and more powerful than most people expect. So after everything we have covered, what actually deserves the biggest focus if you want to support healthier blood pressure in the real world? Not hype, not one miracle food, not one supplement, not one shortcut. The strongest starting point is a simple four-part framework built around what current evidence supports most consistently. Priority number one: improve overall food quality. This is where a lot of people finally start to see the bigger pattern. Blood pressure tends to respond better when meals are built around minimally processed foods instead of ultra-processed ones. That means more vegetables, fruits, beans, high-fiber foods, nuts, seeds, and balanced meals that do not keep pushing the body into the same cycle of spikes, crashes, cravings, and overeating. A DASH-style eating pattern remains one of the most established dietary approaches for helping lower blood pressure. Priority number 2, lower excess sodium, but also raise potassium-rich foods. This is where many people oversimplify the conversation. Yes, too much sodium can raise blood pressure, but the answer is not just eat bland food and hope for the best. A better strategy is to reduce excess sodium from highly processed foods while building meals around potassium-rich whole foods like fruits, vegetables, beans, and other minimally processed staples. That combination supports a healthier blood pressure pattern far better than obsessing over the salt shaker alone. Priority number 3, move consistently, not occasionally, not only when motivation shows up, consistently. Regular walking, aerobic activity, and strength training all matter. The goal is not to become an athlete overnight. The goal is to create a body that handles pressure, metabolism, and vascular stress more effectively over time. Even a basic daily walking habit can be a meaningful step in the right direction, especially for someone starting from a sedentary routine. Priority number 4, work with your doctor, not against treatment. This may be the most important reminder in the entire video. If you are already taking blood pressure medication, do not stop it on your own. Lifestyle improvement and medical treatment are not enemies. For many people, they work best together. Monitor your blood pressure at home. Track the trend. Ask better questions. And if your numbers improve over time, talk with your clinician about what should happen next. The safest progress is guided progress. So here is the takeaway. High blood pressure is not just a salt story, and it is not just a medication story either. It is often a long-term pattern involving food quality, sodium balance, vascular health, movement, body weight, sleep, and metabolic function. And once you see that bigger pattern, the path forward becomes much clearer. Do not wait for next month. Start with your next grocery trip, your next walk, your next meal, your next blood pressure reading. Comment below. What do you think is affecting your blood pressure the most right now? Stress, food, weight, sleep, or lack of exercise? Subscribe now if you want clear, evidence-based health insights without the hype. In the next video, we can break down the best breakfast habits for better blood pressure and metabolic health. This video is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult a healthcare professional for personal medical concerns.